Well, Megan, you chose this episode for us to review, so you get to start.
Well, I mean, I picked it one because it's a fantastic episode, and I thought maybe we've all been just going about our lives too happy without feeling really strong emotions. So this would be a good antidote to that. Because of all of, I mean, there's a lot of really emotionally impactful episodes in DS9 and all the Star Trek, but I think this is one of the top ones for me. And it's, for me, such a good example of something that Star Trek does so well, which is just take these really weighty, really relatable, really sadly relevant issues and treats them in the serious fashion in a science fiction show. So I really love it. I think there's a lot of ground to cover. There's a lot of analogs with things that have happened in this Earth in the past and potentially currently. So I think it's one very worth discussing on this tour of DS9.
Murphy?
Yeah, I agree. It's an incredibly poignant episode. Um, it's probably one of the most well written of the series. I like that you chose what is potentially listed as the best episode of all time, and my previous selection is unanimously considered the worst. But no, Duet's amazing, and it does a lot for character development and cultural development in terms of the first season. It's a nice way to end the season before going into the last little season finale there.
And I would just say that when I watched this the first time to prepare for this podcast, I thought it was perhaps the best DS9 episode, certainly in the top 5. When I rewatched it, I decided that was not correct. It's in the top 5 of Star Trek of all time. It literally blew me away, and probably on 18 or 20 levels that I'm sure we'll go into. But you're absolutely right, Murphy. The writing was incredible. The acting was incredible. Harris Yulin was as fine a villain slash character actor as I can remember. The Cardassian tradition of speaking came through as clearly as it could have in this. Obviously, Kira Nerys, we saw so many sides of her, so much growth from her. I was actually drawn even more to Odo in this episode because he actually seemed to me to be the linchpin of having been with Gul Dukat, served under Gul Dukat, and here he was serving obviously under new masters. And he was the consummate professional. And Quark. When he said hellhole, I thought that had as poignant a description of the camp as it could have been. And to me, it was more poignant coming from him, which he ended with, I wonder if they gamble. So he was still Quark. Yeah. So where do you guys want to go with this one?
Man, when I watched the episode, I also watched it twice kind of in preparing for this. And I think one of the things that stuck out to me the most was Kira's emotional arc over the series, over the episode. So I'd love to talk about that. So, it begins, of course, when she thinks it's going to be effectively a war hero, someone who had survived the Galatep, I suppose, and it was, a symbol for Bajor. Then she finds out it is a Cardassian, therefore probably a war criminal, and this look of transformation that came across her face. It looked to me like she was, the intervening years and time were gone. She was back. She was a terrorist again. It was this like desperate horror. I found the Nana Visitor expressed so amazingly. And then this process of uncovering the plot and what was going on and what was the architecture of what was happening around her. And her really dealing with in her conversations with Sisko and her conversations with Dax, how much is desire for justice and how much is desire for vengeance. And the learning that she does over time, taking a real leap and going from someone who did see things as a freedom fighter in very black and white terms to someone who was being forced to acknowledge the individuality of the people who had been her oppressors. It was a roller coaster, and it really it tears me up. I cried. I think the second time I watched it, just really watching for that. What did you guys think of that particular arc?
It was just fabulous. And, one man's freedom fighter is another man's revolutionary.
Exactly.
And Kira was on both sides of that. It really raised the question for me that I often wonder about is when a former freedom fighter / terrorist becomes the president of a country or in power, how do they make that transition? Some can't. Some are so they're just wired to be freedom fighters or terrorists, and they can't make the transition to running a bureaucracy. And we saw, but some can. And obviously, the Irish revolt against the English in the late 19 teens and early 1920s. Israel was created in 1940s, and there are myriad other examples. The Northern Ireland example. How do you become the ruler of a country? And I thought a lot about Kira and could she really make that evolution to a true statesman or statesperson? Early on, early on at the very start, when we saw her on the bridge, I thought she looks comfortable in that role. She looks comfortable sort of running a space station until the commander got there. And so that was one question I had. For me, one of the questions was up until the time of the second interrogation, meaning when she went down to see the prisoner or the patient for the first time, up until the time they thought he was Goldahar, I thought we were going to see the banality of evil. And
That's
basically
exactly what I was thinking of.
From the trial of Adolf Eichmann, of hey, these people were just little bureaucrats who had a lot of power, and they used it in a very, very destructive way. But then it changed when we thought for some time he was Goldahar, and we saw what I've seen from a lot of other dictators is they saw absolutely nothing wrong with what they did. So it sort of morphed into something else, and then it changed again. And of course, Kira had to have that same arc. So I saw a lot of different things in those scenes that were very uncomfortable to watch, given what happened in former Yugoslavia, starting in the 90s, going forward, obviously Iraq, Iran, and even the current conflict in Israel-Palestine. It's just horrific to have to think of those things happening, I would say between humans, but here between Bajorans and Cardassians. Murphy?
Yeah, no, I immediately, when you were talking about that, that's one of the first things when I watched the episode. There's a scene where Cisco gets contacted by, a Bajoran diplomat on the planet, and he says the words, if this man is Goldar Heel, we want him and we will have him. And that immediately just made me think of, Israel kidnapping Eichmann in 1961 and bringing him back and putting him on trial. This desire, like, we have to have justice. And it's also, Kira says this later too, when she's like, you have to let a Bajoran do this. This is important to let us become a people. We need to sort of self-actualize our own justice and establish ourselves as a legitimate body to try people who have, transgressed against us. And it's draws a lot of parallels to Israel, sort of in its formation in other countries. I also thought about when you were talking about former terrorists becoming statesmen, and can they rise above a certain thing, and can they sort of leave that past behind and strive for the greater good. The parallels between Cardassia and Bajor also made me think a lot of South Africa and the decolonization of South Africa in 93, 94, when this episode was airing. And you have suddenly the ANC, which is a former terrorist group, coming into power in South Africa and sort of having to figure out how to run the country. With Nelson Mandela at the head as president, and someone who had been in prison for a long time and had been a former terrorist. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting parallels and to things going on at that time, and and now. But yeah, that really does make you. It really made me think when I was watching it. Yeah.
So what about? I'm glad you brought up that short scene with the, I guess, Secretary of State or Secretary
Hmm.
maybe of Internal Affairs from Bajor calling Cisco. How did you assess Cisco in this episode? Do you think he led or commanded in the right way? Were his decisions sound? Was he right to give Kira the opportunity to prove to him she could do this professionally and dispassionately, as much passion as we obviously saw from her?
I thought I noticed that little bit too, and I thought it was particularly interesting that the minister called it a special service and offered Cisco congratulations. Really trying to put Bajor and Cisco slash the Federation exactly on the same level, the same side of this dispute, let's call it. And that's so challenging for Cisco to navigate. And when I was thinking about, that impassioned plea that Kira gave him to handle the investigation, from a strictly like procedural standpoint, he probably shouldn't have let her be involved in that. But I don't think he could kind of tolerate the idea that he had a first officer who couldn't handle it. Like, I think it was as much he needed to see Kira be able to handle that role as it would be, emotionally important for her to do so. Yeah, I thought there was
Hmm.
kind of almost a management thing at play there. He needed to know that as a first officer, she can do this kind of difficult work.
So, what about? I thought a lot about TOS, the conscience of the king, of a king. And did this episode tie back to that episode? Was that episode in any way a precursor? I tried as hard as I could to fit the round peg of Duet into the square hole of the conscience of a king, but frankly, at the end of the day, I couldn't, because in the conscience of the king, you had the commander, the man who made the decisions, not a functionary or a file clerk who has had some other goals involved. But in that episode, part of the focus for me was the struggle that both Lieutenant O'Reilly and Captain Kirk had to keep
Hmm.
their emotions in check so that they didn't engage in revenge or simply
Mhm.
vengeance. So, any thoughts on that TOS episode contrasting with this one?
I'm
Yeah, I
afraid
think.
that bit of lore is over my head. Go ahead, Murphy.
Yeah, I'm not well versed enough in TOS, sadly, but knowing a um, sort of the main from what I've watched of TOS, and I've gone through the series I think once. Uh, I I think that there's a certain level of um, kind of serious diplomacy that you find in a lot of TOS episodes, and it sometimes gets overshadowed by other stuff. But it's they're trying to tackle difficult subjects at a difficult time. Um, and I think in terms of Duet, it's tackling a difficult subject from having looking back at it. If we're drawing parallels to the Holocaust or we're drawing parallels to decolonization, these are things that are taking place in the 60s. These are things that by 93 are begun to sort of coalesce. But yeah, no, I don't know enough TOS war, unfortunately, to make any serious comment on that. I am sorry. That is the sort of the blank slate of my Star Trek knowledge.
We're gonna have to start sending each other
There
homework
was
before recordings.
Oh,
so
yes.
we can watch each other's follow-ups.
Oh, yeah. I'll gladly go and
so
binge TOS. Yeah.
when we find out Kira DeReese was a member of an underground or at least a resistance group, Shakir, first of all, to me, that was absolutely no surprise. And what I couldn't remember is, did I know that almost inherently from when the series started, or did I learn that obviously in this episode and other episodes? Anyway, I couldn't remember, but it made perfect sense to me that she was part of the resistance, certainly from some of her comments in later episodes. And the I mean, she killed people and she executed Cardassians, and hopefully they were military targets. But I think even she recognizes, she has to live with that every night when she goes to bed, in her dreams or in her sleep or in her PTSD or however that might manifest itself for her. And that the cost to both sides was horrendous. And some of the most poignant scenes was that not interrogation between she and Marissa, but that dialogue back and forth where he accused her of being a murderer, essentially. Any thoughts on what you guys saw in that?
It's interesting you've mentioned the Cardassian dialogue thing, and this is something that I think what was it that Ira Stephen Bear he calls it the long Cardassian monologue, and you see this as sort of continuing on with Ducat and with Garrick, but the dialogue between the two of them, it's so fantastic. It almost sets a tone for the way that Cardassian, conversation style goes through the rest of the series. It's really interesting to see. And this episode as well, in terms of him describing, the horror that's going on, this is also a continuation of sort of the Cardassian that started in TNG. And, you see with O'Brien when they meet on the ship, and it's sort of like, oh, my enemy is, not so different from me. And then a year before this episode comes out, you have Chain of Command, where Picard gets captured by the Cardassians and he gets tortured. And then you see a little more of the Cardassians becoming evil and Ensign Ro. And but this is really the first time in the series where we've come up against, this is not just a faceless enemy. These are really awful, objectionable things these people are doing. And it's done entirely without violence. It's done entirely through the dialogue that these two people had. There's not really anybody else in the episode. I mean, the rest of the characters, but it's really just a one conversation between these two for a good 40 minutes. And that's amazing, to be able to set that much up in through just that dialogue alone. Yeah, no, I think it's very good. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just on
it's amazing what you can do when you have no budget and you're told you have to have no budget. You can only have dialogue.
Yeah.
You can have a great episode.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, Megan.
Oh, that's okay. I was just, I think about the idea of kind of Kira's reckoning with what she's done and the comparison that Maritza, under the guise of Darheela, is forcing her to make. I thought was really, really interesting because, his motivation there was to goad her into doing what he wanted. And he's saying things that he in context believes to be true in the character that he's playing. And he's just pressing at these buttons that he knows she has because he did that research on her in advance. He requested information about her. He knew that this was, a freedom fighter who now had a high level in government and would be in a position to help him achieve his goal. And I think he knew exactly what to say to her to bring up exactly what you were saying, Tom, these issues of she probably had to do horrible things. And, she made the calculation that the ends would justify the means. And I can't even imagine what making that calculation would feel like or the impact it would have on you, emotionally, psychologically going into the future. And I think part of the realization that I think was so much for her was that when she realized he was giving her what she wanted and kind of being horrified that she had wanted that kind and that level of vengeance. And I thought that was just heartbreaking.
Yeah, there's a line later on.
Well, certainly.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
There's a line later on at the end of the series where she's talking to Legate Damar, and she said Legate Damar's family has been killed by the Dominion, and Damar says, "What kind of a state supports the innocent murder of women and children?" And Kira turns to him and she says, "Yeah, Damar, what kind of people do that?" And then he gets really stone-faced and he walks off, and but that scene always made me think about Kira has to reconcile a lot of that in her past. And she has a conversation with Dax once where Dax is contemplating killing someone, and then she's asking Kira what it's like, and Kira's like, I really don't want to talk about this. Why are you asking me, you know? Yeah, I think she's very haunted by that. You know, it shows in her face the moment you meet her, and it becomes less and less as time goes on. But yeah, oh yeah, there's definitely a lot of skeletons in her closet.
Not that I want to end this podcast, but I want to go to the end of the episode because I want to explore that. And at the end of the episode, Kira is walking Maritza out to send him back to his home world. And a Cardassian who we had been introduced to earlier in the drunk tank because he'd had too much to drink and Odo had thrown him in the drunk tank.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Bajoran, not the Cardassian. He murders Maritza.
Yeah.
And if he had done that and said, this is for everyone who died at the camp, or you were all guilty, would that have changed how we felt about the murder at the end? That's question one. Question two was him being a Cardassian enough? And then number three, and this is the one I haven't worked out yet, which is for this episode to work, did that murder have to happen for the story to work? And that's what I want to pitch to you guys.
Man, heavy hitter, Tom. I think
I thought a lot about this.
I think just to answer in order, you know, would it have changed the story if he had said this is for, you know, the dead of Galatep? I think it would have, because ultimately the death was stupid and pointless. You know, the resolution emotionally had already happened. We knew that Eamon was not Darheal. He and Kira had reached some level of peace and accord. He was going to go on to figure out how to live the rest of his life, having failed in his goal. And then Kira had to be faced with what she had been hours ago. Someone who was willing to take vengeance on any Cardassian who happened to be present. And, you know, if he represented, he was, you know, as far as we know, just a random Bajoran who has this feeling. Now she's reckoning with, what has this made my own people? And I think it was a beautiful ending. It was a fantastic ending. And I think the weight of it was that look on Kira's face at the end, that realization that things have changed now, but her people have changed. They're maybe not what she fought for. And it's just, right. What did you think, Murphy?
Yeah, you raise a good point. It's just, she's sort of realizing that, like, what have we become, you know, which is always the question of, like, people who suffer through a shared trauma for generations, you know, you get this imprinted behavior. And then in the eyes of this drunk Bajoran guy, murder is totally fine because he obviously grew up in the occupation and he witnessed people getting killed. And to him, killing a Cardassian is you know, no great shakes. Like, he thinks it's fine. They don't have any value to him. I do think, you know, you talked about the relationship that she had with Maritza too, where they're starting to get closer together. It reminded me of later on when she befriends a guy named Tekeni Gamor, who's a Cardassian legate or gull or something. And he becomes kind of a surrogate father to her in a lot of ways. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think that this episode is sort of the start of that. And if it had ended differently, and Maritza hadn't been killed, I wonder if that would have been the storyline going forward, you know, that he would have ended up being that character, but who knows? You could speculate on what the plot lines would have been for various things. But yeah, it's a very strong, sobering ending. I mean, it's like, it just out of nowhere, and he comes up and stabs him and he dies. Like, it's very in your face for a Star Trek episode. Even DS9.
I think that was a really interesting point, Murphy. What role could he have taken if he had gone back to be that kind of force for change within Cardassian culture, rather than trying to enforce this public reckoning? And I thought that was so interesting about his character, is his whole charade of taking on this persona he felt was horrifying. out of love for Cardassia and a desire for them to be accountable and to be better and to survive, as he said. What could he have done if he hadn't
Gamor, Tekeni
blotted
Gamor,
Yeah.
her father there, the Cardassian general, he ends up being part of the Cardassian dissident movement, which, you know, brings down the military government and sets up the Tapa Council and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, he's you know, and Kira kind of outs him for that, and he gets in trouble. But that's kind of the role that I think Maritza would have ended up doing. You know, he would have been this lowly file clerk, but a voice in the wilderness back on Cardassia, shouting out that they have to be held accountable. And I think there are definitely people on Cardassia who would have picked up on that. Yeah.
Tom, what did you think about the answers to your questions?
Let me pick up on your last point, Murphy, and tie it back into South Africa, because I've been thinking about that since you raised it. Could Maritza have been the start of some sort of internal Cardassian truth and reconciliation? I don't think they were ever going to reconcile with the Bajorans based on what they did, but could Cardassia have picked up a mirror and looked at itself?
It's funny. I was thinking when I was watching this last night and thinking about the whole South Africa question, and I was looking up info about truth and reconciliation, and I remember being young and listening to recordings of people, you know, on both sides of the calamity and what had happened under apartheid, and it's sobering. And I think, I think someone with his organizational capabilities would be able to set something up like that. But, you know, whether or not it would break that, you know, sort of hard Cardassian exterior, I don't know. I'd like to think so. But, I'm not sure.
So I started off my section or my first remarks by saying how important and good I thought this episode was in DS9, but then amending that to the entire Star Trek oeuvre. What are your guys' thoughts on where this episode should stand in either one of those?
Very much near the top of all. Off the top of my head, I can't think of one that I found more emotionally impactful, and one that kind of brings home to me the timeless nature of the issue and how horrifying it is that it's a timeless issue. I think I don't know that even outside of Star Trek, many other franchises have addressed this in such a way, or at least, especially in such a way that is so lasting and memorable and relatable on both sides. I think it's way up there, if not the top, near the top.
Murphy?
Yeah, I think it's definitely up there. It might even, for me, be in the top 5 Star Trek episodes of all time. I don't know where in that 5 I would put it, but in terms of emotional impact, there are very few episodes that are as compelling as this one. You know, we have episodes of, you know, action, or we have episodes that are really sort of intellectual or bring up a lot of interesting points about philosophy or diplomacy. But this episode, and it's sort of face to face, you know, dealing with horror and brutality, not something we get very often in Trek in this level of seriousness. So yeah, I think the way it was shot, I think its place in the season, its character, you know, driven writing, I definitely think it's one of the best episodes in all of Trek. In fact, I'm trying to think of another episode from another series that's more. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank. Like I said, Chain of Command is also very sobering for the same kind of reasons, but it's a little more in your face violent, so I don't know if it's up there. Brothers is very good. You know, like I said, Picard kind of breaking down. Yeah, there's a few. Yeah, but it's very good.
And one other thing, this episode struck me, and I'm sorry, I can't remember which one of you guys raised this, was for some reason I had in my head that this was, you know, a Federation shop, and, you know, It was just sort of Federation run.
Mhm.
And it struck me in this episode, the disparate, obviously characters, but more importantly, the disparate types of issues that each one of them brought. So we had Bajor, we had Kira, we had the Federation, we had Cisco, we obviously have Cardassia,
Mhm.
and that there's really a lot more going on than simply, Picard saying engage.
Mhm.
And I don't know why I had falsely remembered that, but this episode, in addition to showing me the emotional growth of Kira Nerys, really drove home. There's a
Yeah.
lot of different ideas and thoughts going on here.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a lot of different concerned parties because they're reckoning with the fact that people hurt others,
Mhm.
but now you still kind of have to work together.
Mhm.
And you've got the Federation as a mediating force in this, but their hands are tied in some ways by their own regulations from the actions as individuals people might choose to take. And I thought kind of, Tom, as you said, they dealt with that really interestingly, and they really did set up the different players as these unique actors who have their own motivations and who have challenging roles in terms of how they're supposed to behave in different situations. Really, the institutional versus the personal, I guess, was a really big theme that came up, and that's pretty common in DS9. Is what do you have to sacrifice to the institution, and what can you take on your own agency? Oh, it's good. I hadn't really thought about it in that way until now.
Yeah. Well, that's like
okay. Well,
yeah. I was just going to say that you're talking about making sacrifices like that. That's what Cisco does later in the Pale Moonlight, right? Where he basically has to, do I, uphold my Federation values, or do I, lie and cheat and bribe men to cover up crimes in order to save billions? And it's that question of like, well, how far am I willing to go to save the principles I need? How far do I have to break them? It's interesting.
should we go around for final thoughts?
Sure.
Megan?
I need a break after that one.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those episodes. It's almost you have a little bit of a mental emotional hangover after really digging into it and thinking about it. And I think, Tommy, as you point out, the more you watch it, the more you see in it, and the more different layers of meaning it has. And man, I can't believe they were putting this on TV in the early '90s, and I'm so glad that they did. And I think, yeah, this is a strong episode that sets up as continuing to set up so many of the issues that the series is going to deal with. So I think it was really foundational as well as being really important.
Oh yeah.
Murphy?
Yeah, it's extremely foundational. In that it kind of closes a little bit of a character development arc within Kira. It sets us up for a progressive Bajor that in the next season could go in either direction. It introduces Neela, who works with O'Brien, and you end up seeing over an episode or so. There's also a really good point. There's just a moment of dialogue where Kira says to Odo, he was in there bragging. He's proud of what he did to us. And I like that she says us to Odo, because it really sets up this affinity that the two of them have, where she sees Odo as Bajoran. Like, he's not a changeling, or he's not a shapeshifter. He's Bajoran. He's as Bajoran as she is. And this is something that continues to sort of grow between them. We don't see a lot of interaction with them in the early part of the series, but yeah, it's sort of the blossoming of that relationship between them. I really like that. It's a throwaway piece of dialogue, but it's really well done. Yeah, I think it's a really good episode. It deserves a lot more credit than it gets. I mean, even if it's the best episode of DS9, I think it gets overlooked in Trek a lot, and I think that's a shame. Definitely worth watching entirely.
The I don't want to say it was a throwaway line, but the one line I really loved, or was a piece of dialogue between Gul Dukat and Odo when they have their first conversation, and Gul Dukat says, you know, I fondly remember our playing games together, and
Mhm.
Odo says, we played a game once and you cheated. And that was the end of that little witty repartee.
Mhm.
And I thought Odo really shined in that. And when I said I saw he as a security officer and the professionalism he brought to that position, for me was literally encapsulated in that short scene. Yeah, this was a very emotional episode for me. It drew obviously back to as far back as the Holocaust, and if I thought about it, probably a lot further back than that. But conflicts that have been occurred in my lifetime and atrocities on both sides, I thought were handled incredibly well in this episode.
Mhm.
All right, guys. Till next time.
Next time. Thank you.